Welcome to the Six Conditions podcast, where we explore the science and art of great teams. Join show hosts Drs. Ruth Wageman and Krister Lowe for pithy summaries of great research being done on teams and organizations, as well as inspired and artful approaches for using those ideas to enable brilliant collaborations. Let's get today's conversation started.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Six Conditions podcast, where we're exploring the science and art of great teams. Hey, Ruth, welcome back yourself. And here we are in episode number 5. We're going to be exploring the 3 enabling conditions that accelerate a team's development into brilliant collaborations.
Hey, Krister. Great to be back with you again.
Likewise. So this is a cool episode. I think it's, building on, we touched on the 3 essential conditions last time. Today, we're going to be talking about the 3 enabling conditions. So this is really about what really catalyzes a really good design and breathes life into it. And so that's really what we're going to be exploring today. So maybe just to tee this up and start getting into the topic, what's on your mind as you're coming into today's episode, Ruth?
Well, since I know one of the things that we're going to be talking about today is sound structure and norms, I was thinking about all of the various ways in teams that I've been part of or observed or taught or supported over the years go about actually enforcing their norms or expressing them.
Your mischievous smile is giving that away.
Yeah, because one of the challenges for teams is you can have these norms, like everybody has to participate equally and everybody needs to show up on time and
respect each other. And
the ground rules that teams have. And then there's the challenge of, okay, we've said them, but how do we actually make these into something more than a list on paper that never actually affects how people behave? And we also know that norms emerge and regardless of whether you've made them explicit, and a lot of the implicit norms that groups have can be pretty unhealthy. So speaking of unhealthy, one of the things that my colleagues and I who work in the arena of health reflected is that we have a tendency to convene these very intensive learning and work experiences, but we'll have this agenda that runs from 8:30 in the morning to 5:30 in the afternoon. We wind up running over all of our breaks. We have caterers bringing in like cookies and pretzels and fried things, and we're supposed to be about health. And
right.
So we've been trying to build much more into our rhythm of work. Getting up and going out for a walk and talk together, or taking an optional yoga break, and always ensuring that the food that is being served actually supports people's health. So that the purpose underlying our group is actually being expressed in the way that we work together. So that's one illustration that's been very much on my mind.
Having integrity.
So bringing to life the things that you say that you're actually about. But the thing that had me sort of laughing mischievously is one of the things that a lot of teams, particularly young teams, have a hard time doing is calling each other on norm violations. And so that I've had student teams come up with some pretty creative ways of saying, we'd really like to have a conversation about our norms. And the one that stays in my mind is the group that agreed that if they needed to have a conversation about their norms, someone would say, "These potato chips are stale." And that would be a way of triggering. Oh, yes, that would be the cue, right? Without saying somebody in this team is behaving badly. It was a funny way of saying, let's talk about whether we're actually living up to what we agreed.
That's cool.
So how about you? What's on
Nice
your mind from your work?
I knew coming into this episode, actually, this topic's really important to me. As I mentioned in one of our first episodes, 4 years ago, I decided to kind of niche down in the area of team coaching. And part of the reason was that I found that doing these away days and team retreats and launches were really wonderful, but I would oftentimes walk away and see the same team come back and real behavior changed, really didn't change. And so people got inspired by the visions and all that. But there was something about what kept coming to me was the lack of discipline around what does it take to actually keep a team together and focused and to start to get to the point where it becomes a virtuous cycle where the ways of working, the norms become part of the culture, right? It's kind of a thing where you go away to a training workshop and they say, if you don't practice one of the skills you're learning for the next 3 weeks, it doesn't really have a chance of becoming heuristic and, moving out of the realm of requiring deliberate effort before it becomes kind of part of the automatic machinery of the team. So I think that's what's coming up for me. And as I think about some of the best teams I've been on, it's really about developing work practices and norms, getting creative around that, building a winning formula, and trying all kinds of things, playing with cadences, working in sprints, or, bringing in retrospectives, using technologies like Trello or other things to track the work. So I think this is an area for me where I think it moves out of the exciting, fun stuff of vision and purposing and all that dreamy, great, goal setting type of thing, to really getting a bit more granular around how are we going to win as a team and a winning formula, and just cooking up a special sauce together to make that happen. So I love this work, both the teams that I'm on and doing this work with the teams we consult to. So this is a topic that gets me excited, the enabling conditions. So
excellent. Well, we should dig into those.
All right,
into those together. Yeah.
Yes. So our key question then, you want to tee it up?
Sure. We had asked you to reflect on a question about a particular one of the enabling conditions, which is how would you go about helping a team to develop healthy norms and work practices? Really very much related to what Krister and I were both talking about and reflecting about in our work. Healthy norms and work practices, ways of working that are explicit and intentionally managed by the group that actually helps them to accomplish their purposes. So that's among the things that we're going to be exploring in some detail in this episode. And I wonder if maybe we should just start with a recap of the 3 enablers, Krister.
That sounds good. Yeah. So you want to do that, Ruth, or?
Yeah, I could do that. So the 3 enablers, right? These are the 3 enabling conditions. The last of the 3 conditions are a sound structure, which has 3 elements to it. So a sound structure is the right team size, neither too big nor too small to actually accomplish the work. Meaningful team tasks that really express the purpose and that allow the team members to use their full complement of talents and their initiative and judgment to accomplish that task. And then thirdly, norms of conduct. So clear, explicit rules of what's acceptable, what's not acceptable behavior in the group, and some means of actually keeping those norms alive and enforcing them in the team. That's the first of the enablers, sound structure. And then the second of the enablers is a supportive organizational context, meaning that the structures and the systems that are part of the larger organizational context are designed in ways that actually contribute to and make teamwork easier rather than harder. So elements like the reward system, the information system, the education system, the basic material resources, all of those things collectively enable the teams in the organizational context to work effectively. And then the last of the 3 enablers is team coaching. So someone who's available to intervene in real time in the team's work in ways that help them work more and more effectively with each other over time. That's the 3 enablers.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should, in going in order, we start with sound structure and move along and unpack those a little bit more and share some illustrations and stories. Sound good?
Yeah, that sounds like a great way.
So let's get into sound structure then, Ruth. So as you think about working with teams around sound structure, whether it's dealing with the size issue, I think we telegraphed in the last episode, a lot of times we're meeting teams that are in the desire to be inclusive. Leaders are kind of throwing everybody into the team and that, creates, advantages, but some real challenges for teams around efficiency. But then, getting at what are some ways to help teams identify norms and, get clear about what are the handful of things we should be most putting our attention on. So what comes up for you? Which of those subdimensions would be interesting to
let me start with team size. As you know, I do a lot of teaching of the 6 conditions model as well as working with a lot of teams, and I often get questions from team members and team leaders about, so how do we know if we're the right size? Or even more explicitly, they'll say, so what exactly is the right size of teams? Like, is there a rule from the research about how many people you should have in your team? And there are a couple of reflections I always share with them. If you actually look at the team's research that explicitly looks at, is this team too big or too small? What's its impact on effectiveness? A lot of them converge around the number 5. Now, I'm not saying that every team should be should be a team of 5, but a whole lot of the evidence does seem to converge around a handful of people seems to be the right number of people. And actually, if you look at some of the modern evidence that that actually uses different kinds of media to record participation levels in teams. What we see is that once you get to about 6 people in a team, you can't really have a high degree of participation among all the members. There's just not that much room for more voices than that around the table. But one of the findings that I like to share with people from the research literature is that the number of process problems, like an inability to coordinate or personality conflicts, the number of process problems tracks not the number of individual members, but the number of links among members. And, we often share a graph of this with people that shows that, for example, if you have 3 members, you have 3 links. If you have 4 members, you have 6 links. If you have 5 members, you have 10 links. So the number of links between people grows exponentially each time you add a member, and the process problems tracks that number of links. So the bottom line is, each time you add a member, you're exponentially increasing the kinds of coordination problems that teams can run into. And if I were to share one more rule of thumb from the leadership team's research, we really saw that teams that got above single digits were usually seriously underbounded. It was not clear who's really in the team, and really struggled a lot to do any kind of collective decision making. So, that's an array of the kinds of findings that I like to share with people to help them think about this question of, how do we actually right size our team and make sure that we're not creating unnecessary problems for the team's effectiveness.
It's a little bit of an interesting dilemma, because I think there's the desire for everybody wants to be included, but then people get frustrated with the lack of efficiency and just the process loss that happens when you have such a big team. And I know one of the things I picked up from you is, when you're working with teams where you have the opportunity, is to really identify a core decision-making team that can really drive decision-making, but then have the larger group of people there as a consultation body or as a coordination body. And so I think there's creative ways you can work with the size issue. But so it doesn't have to be one or the other, but I think it's really putting on the table and getting really clear about whether the size we have is enabling or disabling us from accomplishing the work we need to do. So moving on from the size in the team to, looking at the task design, one of the things I picked up in my language working with you, Ruth, was the language of must-win battles or mission-critical tasks. So we've developed some techniques around helping teams through crowdsourcing and other techniques really come up with a lot of great ideas if they could only double down on a couple of things that would most move the needle for them on achieving their purpose in the short run. What would they focus on? And, helping teams just get that clarity. They love that. So, it's a great way to help a team get really focused on, there's lots of things we could be working on. There's probably a huge backlog of tasks waiting for us to focus on. But if together we committed to a few and started to develop some discipline around that, we could really start getting some traction and lift. And so I find that language that I learned from you again around must-win battles, mission-critical tasks, create some urgency. And I think it kind of links up to the compelling purpose. When you feel the purpose is important and it ignites a fire, people really want to get concrete. And so getting really clear on the handful of priorities. And we use a technique around before action reviews to do that. And it really links up to what we were talking about earlier, how a lot of times we get these norms that are nice values around openness and trust and communication. But if we can actually link the norms to the specific things we're working on, you start to get norms that are a lot more context specific and task specific. And then they have a little bit more teeth and I think are less likely just to show up on the nice posters that you see everybody ignoring and walking by in the hallways of organizations. So,
I just picking up what you're saying, I think there are two really powerful lessons of practice that I've learned from our joint work recently, and one of these has to do with the, as you say, the must-win battles, or identifying the high priority tasks that would really help the team accomplish something really significant against its purpose. And I want to give a shout out to Liberating Structures for, Liberating Structures is a website. Just Google Liberating Structures, you'll find it. That has a lot of practices that you can use with teams that gets the collective energy behind something and really can surface and use all the ideas in a team. And we've been using their version of, is it 25-10-1 crowdsourcing?
Yep, 25-10 crowdsourcing. Yeah.
As a way of taking a team from getting clear about its purpose to really identifying some critical tasks. And what I've come to love about it is, when you're done with the exciting work of purpose, and everybody has to get down to what you call the discipline, Krister, of identifying key tasks, there a little dread seeps in. Yeah. Like, now we're going to have to do the hard, detailed, disciplined work of figuring out what the tasks are we need to do. And 25-10 crowdsourcing can actually keep the energy in the room. So in brief, it asks everybody in the team to think of one or two things, really bold ideas, that if the team could accomplish in the next three months, whatever the critical time period is next for the team, that they would be really excited about accomplishing. And just in brief, it helps the team go through a process of sharing all of these ideas and narrowing down to a few. And because it keeps people in dialogue with each other and moving around and in a generative state of mind, I think you don't lose any of the energy that has come around from the clarification of purpose in getting down to those critical tasks.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing. In 20 or 25 minutes, you can just help a group source ideas, vet them, prioritize, and commit to a couple, and they feel great about it. And it's, it lifts the energy rather than sucks the energy out. But we've also been feeding that into then really looking at in the before as part of a process of developing a really concrete before action review of, so given those mission critical tasks we just identified, what's going to get in our way and likely conspire to make sure we fail, whether it's within us and our ways of working or the environments that we're in. And I think so continuing the reflection once you have that has been powerful. It also brings in a lens of learning. So what have we learned in the past about being smart, working smarter rather than harder, or creative ways to overcome those obstacles? And then that really feeds into the last part of the sound structure around, so given that, what are the work practices and norms that we really, given what we're going to try to accomplish with these must-win battles, would really help us ensure we succeed and that we could commit to. And I think what you find is a lot of those get really concrete around how are we going to use our meetings? What are we going to do in between meetings, et cetera? And lots of rich stuff comes up there that I think really changes the nature of the way teams are approaching their work. So I'm finding that kind of before action review and going through these steps in a process in an hour or 90 minutes, teams can really get a real game plan together and a sense of getting creative about the ways we can win together. And that gets me excited. Yeah.
I've also, shout out to the 4-Quadrant partners and to all of our colleagues at the Society for Organizational Learning and others who have developed the before action review into a really great learning practice for harvesting collective wisdom. I think one of the things I've most enjoyed about teaching teams how to work with this is, norms of conduct. The definition of norms of conduct in this model are agreements about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable behavior in the group. And if you just pose the question to a newly formed group or a group that's been working together for a while, what do you want your ground rules to be, or what are the norms you want to have? Very often it stays at a level that isn't really related to the work. Yeah. So you get a lot of hygiene norms, like everybody participate, put away your cell phones, turn up on time. And I'm not saying those things are trivial, but they're not helping the group to develop the precise ground rules of practice that are going to help them live up to their purpose. And what the before action review does is it anchors them in the tasks and what they're going to hold themselves accountable for accomplishing in some defined period of time. And then it harvests all of their collective learning about what it's going to take to accomplish those things. And that's what becomes the norms and the work practices. And it also sets them up for this really lovely iterative cycle where, having done that, you can then 3 months down the road say, well, what did we accomplish of what we said we were going to do, and what contributed to that, and what got in the way of that? And it really brings the cycle of developing new norms and work practices that really are constructive. It brings that to life. And as you say, Krister, into a discipline that involves practice and learning and practice and learning.
This is an area where, not all teams, but a number of teams, I really bring in some of the agile practices around cadences and how to bring in tighter cycles of performance and learning and retrospectives, and even using technologies or visualizing your work with Kanban boards or, tools like Trello, which is kind of virtual Kanban
Krister, would you
board.
mind, for our listeners who haven't worked with agile practices before, just to give a few sentences of definition of what those are and why they might want to explore them?
Yeah, well, I mean, it comes out of the software development world, and I think there was just a finding that the old forms of software development, the waterfall method, oftentimes would just, teams would basically develop software, ship them out to the customers at the end of the development cycle. And oftentimes by then, when it would come out, the customer had already moved on or the requirements had shifted. And so they said there's got to be a better way where we start to actually work in tighter cycles of performance and feedback and start shipping out smaller pieces of work to customers in a much more iterative, faster way. And so a number of practices around self-managing teams, how do teams actually work in cycle sprints, for example, 1 or 2 week sprints, and really get clear about what they're going to deliver that adds immediate value to customers and gets feedback on, so they don't wait 6 months to get in alignment with their customers. And it led to practices around developing a backlog of tasks to work on, having daily stand-up meetings, if you're using the Scrum, approach, to reflecting every week or two on what did we accomplish, having a meeting with the customer to present and get feedback. And so I think for those of us who don't come from a technology background or software development world, a lot of our work practices have emerged in an implicit ways, and we don't really examine them or make them explicit, right? So when I go into many organizations, or a lot of the teams I've been on before I was introduced to some of the agile methods, we have our weekly meeting. Somehow work kind of happens in between, but maybe there could be a more accountability or a little bit more structure or more touch points, for example. And so I think something like a daily stand-up meeting can help a team that's really executing just, have the contact to keep support, get the accountability, raise issues early so that they don't escalate into larger problems. So I think there's a lot of really rich stuff coming out of the agile world, and other methods as well, around how we can get creative around approaching work in novel ways, right? And really, I think that's where we start to really unleash some of the power of a team and how we can support and challenge each other to keep accountable and keep motivated and focused. Like if I just meet with my team once a week, I'm really energized when I come out of that meeting, but within a couple of days, my motivation and focus can really get distracted by all the other things that are emerging. So what are some of the structures that can help us as a team, keep focused? And that's why, this condition we're talking about, sound structure, I think that's part of the mix of opportunities that we can play with. I don't know if that answers your question, Ruth, or helps.
It does. Do you have a favorite resource or anything listeners could read further if they wanted to explore a little bit about Agile?
I think for people who are new, I have a book here on my shelf back here by one of the founders of Scrum. And let me see if I can find it, by Jeff Sutherland. It's called Scrum. Here it is. I think this is a good one. This is kind of written for non-techie types. So
yeah,
it's
perfect.
it's called Scrum: The Art of Doing Twice the Work in Half the Time. And so that's a great one. I think you can immediately find a couple of things in there. I've also been really influenced by one of our colleagues, Gabe Abella, again, who's introduced me to Kanban. So which really comes out of the lean manufacturing and, back in the day of car automotive manufacturing, around visualizing work, that when we actually start to put up on a task board or a Kanban board the work we're focusing on, it helps us start to get outside of our work and make the work itself part of the team in a way. And so when a team is standing around looking at a Kanban board, which is visualizing all the work we have in flow, we can start to look at, is work flowing through our system or not? For many of us, when you actually start to visualize all the things you're working on, it's frightening how many things we've committed to and how many things we have in motion. And when you step outside and start to look at that, it gives you an opportunity then to start to set some limits, decide what to focus on, what are we going to be accountable to. And so, I was on a plane coming back from Europe about a year ago, and I decided to just download, I was reading books on Kanban, and I decided to download all the tasks I was working on. And I had an outrageous list of 85 different tasks, personal and professional, that I was working on. And what, the Kanban books would talk about in Scrum book, and some of the Scrum I was reading about, is that practices would talk about that when you have that many things going on in your head, just keeping all that stuff in control creates work in and of itself. It's called existential overhead, right? And so by starting to put your work on a visual board, you start to, it's captured somewhere, it creates some psychological space for you, but you can start to look at how oftentimes the tyranny of the urgent ends up keeping you from focusing on the most important things. Yeah. And so I think these are great tools. They're not right for all teams or for all circumstances, but I think this is part of the rich space of where, teams have become real serious in organizations, and the teams that are disciplined and are really, getting innovative using technology tools, these methods, I think they're performing. I mean, all the great companies of our time, the biggest market cap companies, have all been, organized. A lot of it, and a lot of them are technology companies, the Googles and Apples of the world, but a lot of them are because the teams are working with these agile practices, right? So, I think there's something from there for us to learn. And again, you don't have to be a software development team to benefit from some of these techniques or apply the whole approach. You can just cherry pick the things that might work well with your team.
Yeah. So what you're describing about priorities and the tyranny of the urgent raises a couple final points that I would love to add here about sound structure and about tasks in particular. One of the ironies that I often talk about in leadership teams, it goes like this. Everybody wants to be a member of the leadership team, but nobody wants to come to the meetings. And that is because what winds up on the agenda is the urgent and tactical. That very often the way that teams choose what they're going to be working on when they convene is somebody says, hey, what do you guys want to talk about? Yeah. And they wind up with a very long list of updates, the urgent operational things that have come up, rather than somebody taking the responsibility to say, okay, this is what our purpose is. This is what we've said our highest priorities are to achieve. Now, what's the work that we need to do collectively when we're together that's going to advance that? And that aspect of sort of agenda discipline and of somebody taking the responsibility to make sure that when you are spending the time convening the team as a whole, all hands on deck, as you said, that you're making the best possible use of and doing the things that really need multiple intelligences, need dialogue, need joint decision making in order to get the work done. So that aspect of team practice and of bringing team tasks to the fore. Right. That are really being worked on together in those convenings, I think is a really important aspect of bringing, this condition to life for task performing teams. Yeah.
I love that. And I think, there's lots of elements around now where a lot of us are not co-located. So how do you use the technology piece? Do you want to commit to X number of face-to-face meetings? But even I think a little bit about sound structure. I was working with a learning team, a leadership team that wanted to really think about the future of the organization and start to create some space to invent the next version of the company. And, what we found was sitting in the leader's office with the leader behind his desk and us on the other side wasn't the right physical even setup for the room. And so we started to have meetings where sometimes we went on walking meetings just to kind of get things flowing, or we met in different kinds of spaces and we started to think about what are the spaces that would really support a group that needs to do creative thinking, right? So it's a way of kind of just even taking sound structure to the element of looking at what are the smart tools available to us, whether it's technology or physical space or modes of working even, we complain a lot, Ruth, I know you and I, where we go in to do team sessions and we're stuck behind these giant board tables, and the room is just not fit for doing collaborative work. It's fit for, a hierarchical report out rather than something that encourages a dynamic interaction between members, right? So, yeah.
I think you've taken us right into the next of the enablers, the supportive organizational context, because I think one of the aspects of organizational contexts that can create obstacles for effective collaboration is the space and time and material resources to actually work collectively. So you gave the illustration of space around when we're trying to work with teams in a teaching and learning setting. I have two more illustrations that I think are important aspects of how these material resources or the space setup can get in the way or support it. Many of the leadership teams that I have worked with, you walk into the executive suite and you've got a set of rooms that are pretty distant from each other, and there's a wall and there's a door, and there may or may not be a name on it, but there's a secretary behind it, and then there's another individual hidden in the back room. And that is not a setup that facilitates the casual contact that people need to actively collaborate with each other. And no wonder the only quote teamwork gets done in the formal meetings that happen, because the space is preventing anything happening in a collaborative way in between. One of the powerful illustrations that I had was work that I was trying to do with teams in healthcare who had an aspiration to do multidisciplinary rounds. So to bring the treating physicians and the nurse teams and other practitioners together in a round on a floor to talk in a really collaborative way about each of the patients and what they were doing for them and what the issues were. And they found that the single greatest obstacle to this was not what people would argue is like the culture of silos in health. It was the mere physical fact that the floor was structured in a way that nobody could convene in a group at any place on those floors. It simply wasn't designed for that. So the need to actually rethink the space and time dimensions that the organizations, have already put in place that may actually create obstacles. That's part of the work of helping teams.
Yeah, so I love this. This is a really great expression of an enabling environment or enabling organizational context for your work. And, I think one of the things we found is many of the teams, especially ones that are kind of new to forming, oftentimes you'll see in a measurement around supportive context, they don't feel as supported as they would like to. And I think some of that is about team maturity, and some of that may be real data that they're not getting the space, or oftentimes time is coming up. I'm noticing people just are over committed again because we have no limit on the amount of workflow, work that we're committing to, and work is getting bottlenecked in our teams. But I think this is also something around that when teams get really mature, they start to have the confidence and have enough internal alignment and cohesion that becomes a resource to project themselves onto their stakeholder environment, to go out and engage the people who can influence them around the resources they need or the relationships they need to influence to be effective. And that for me gets to be one of the things I love about this condition is it really opens up a team creating value with the environment that it's a part of. And this becomes a really rich area, again, to do back to more of that stakeholder work and getting teams out of a victim mindset of we're not getting what we need to do our work, to actually going out there and coaching them to go out and engage the people who you need to engage to get what you need, and or to create the value in the stakeholders out there where, value creation lies, right? So
it was a great irony in the leadership team's study. We used the team diagnostic survey to assess the 6 conditions in these leadership teams around the world. And the supportive organizational context is how they're rewarded, the degree to which the information system provides the information they need, the degree to which they can get the training and technical consultation or the material resources to do their work. And they had universally bad scores on them. And I think it is ironic that the team at the top of the organization who has more control over their resources and systems than any other team is in this victim mentality. It's saying, well, it's just not setting us up for success. And they can indeed make a difference to those things. And as you say, getting them to think about, so how would you exercise influence in the broader system so that it is providing the resources you need to collaborate brilliantly rather than putting obstacles in the way of that.
Yeah, that's cool. And, this is all kind of a natural lead into the final part of the 3 enabling conditions around team coaching. And I know for many of us who are, went to team coaching before we discovered the 6 conditions, we were a little bit flabbergasted when we came to see some of your research findings that what you found was that when teams were not well designed on the other 5 conditions, no amount of great team coaching really would do much to help move the needle in those teams. And so I think for a lot of us, it was like, dead in the tracks, because for many of us, we would get called in to work with teams because there was dysfunction or there's conflict going on or the team just wasn't getting alignment. And we would start coaching the team around the relationships and all that kind of stuff. And, I think what your research really found is when in the absence of really good team design, all that kind of work really doesn't really give you much lift. But when a team is well designed on the other 5 conditions, team coaching can act as a catalytic effect and augment a team. And, some of fine tuning around helping that team really keep on course and, avoid process losses and really take advantage of that design.
Yeah, this is the organization science paper, team design versus coaching. And it's one of those instances in which I went into the research with one set of questions and expectations and came out with something entirely not what I expected, but happily in an interesting way, because I had gone into this really to understand what kinds of coaching helps teams. And I did learn some things about that. But the primary finding, that interaction effect that you're naming, was that when a team did not have the right people and the purpose wasn't clear and the tasks were not interdependent and the rewards were individualistic, that all of those design conditions together meant that teams could not take advantage of even large quantities of really excellent coaching, that you cannot coach a badly designed team to greatness. But when teams were in really good shape on those conditions, really good coaching actually had a powerful positive effect. So it's this very interesting interaction effect where if you build a sturdy platform, you can then, in the hands-on coaching, really make a difference. And I think one of the other interesting findings out of that research was also that the very well-designed teams were quite robust. So I also measured poor coaching, like how much were their managers micromanaging them and telling them all their problems and how to fix them. And when teams were well-designed, they could tolerate that kind of ineffective coaching, and it wasn't particularly undermining. They're sort of robust and healthy in a way that allows them to take things in and use them or not, and be increasingly self-managing and self-directing in the way that we operate. So that's why we put this as the last of the enablers. That if you're going to, teams can indeed benefit greatly from available expert coaching, but that effect is really contingent on whether you've gotten those first 5 conditions in good shape.
Yeah, we wrote a chapter together in the team coaching handbook, Ruth, around what we come to call structural coaching versus emergent process coaching. And so, for those who, team coaches out there, you can, take some heart, because there's a lot of opportunity for us to help teams, to coach teams and team leaders around getting the other 5 conditions in place so that they can then take advantage of the ongoing emergent process coaching that we can bring. And in this model, team coaching is viewed as a function of a team, just like leadership is a function of a team that can be carried out by certain individuals or from the group as a whole. So whether it's the team leader as the team coach, an external person from outside the company or in the learning, OD and learning function, or is it the team members themselves doing the team coaching? Again, we're agnostic about, who does that, but it's a function that, one of the 6 conditions, and 6th in order of when it most matters, and it's kind of quotidian order of sequencing of things. So,
We're going to spend some time in a later episode on a lot of the nuances of team coaching and the timing and focus. So I won't emphasize that right now, except for one other finding from the research I did on team coaching and design that has some implications for what you're focusing on if you're a team coach working with a team and its practices in real time. One of the forms of coaching that I measured there was interpersonal coaching that was focused on building the quality of relationships among members. And the two things I want to say about this is one, intervening in the interpersonal relationships among members to help them build better relationships can build better relationships, but it doesn't affect team performance, right? So having better relationships is not in the causal chain that drives team performance effectiveness. And there are a whole bunch of different studies, including, my favorite, Kaplan's piece on the absence of evidence that process consultation improves team task performance. So I'm not just relying on my own research on this one, but the other thing that I saw in this particular study of mine that I'm referencing is that the problems in the interpersonal relationships were actually driven by flaws in the team design in the first place. So when the team didn't have agreement on its purpose and had no norms of conduct in place and were being asked to do tasks that didn't really make sense to be done by a team, that could erupt in breakages in their relationships that then of course sort of invites coaching around interpersonal relationships. So it's just an invitation to think about the role of interpersonal relationships in a different way. I personally think of them as valuable in and of themselves, but one of the ways of helping people to develop excellent relationships is to set them up with these positive conditions in a way that they can accomplish meaningful things together that all of them care about and that they feel proud of.
Yeah. Well, I think what this kind of gets into is, conversation we've already been pointing at, and why these structural conditions are so important, and that structure drives a lot of behavior, right? And so feeling good about each other doesn't drive structure, right? It may add some grease to the wheels or, facilitate, but it's a different causal relationship, right? So I think it's the structure drives behavior rather than the other way around. So yeah, I think that one requires a deeper dive. I know that's another counterintuitive finding, but that can be hard for people to swallow who, really like to come in and feel like it's the relationships that's, at the end of the day, the thing that, drives the effectiveness. But I think what the data is suggesting here, what you found, is it's really the opposite way, that we actually, it's performance and getting the structure in place, which enables us to feel good about each other, which then kind of helps that become a virtuous cycle. So good. More food for thought. So this kind of wraps up our third three enabling conditions. In our last episode, we talked about the three essential conditions, but together as a gestalt, they work together as in an interdependent way. And we like to say that putting these 6 conditions in place is really the act of leadership that all teams really can influence. And so these are things that we can influence. They can be measured. They can be installed to a large extent by deliberate efforts. And it's really one of the most powerful things you can do. I know one of the quotes by Richard Hackman I really love is he said, when you guys were looking at when leadership matters most, it's leadership, the active leadership that can be most powerful and has the most longitudinal effects, is really putting these 6 conditions in place. Leadership efforts after that don't account for a whole lot in terms of the outcomes. And, that kind of is where we're going to be heading in our next episode. In episode number 6, we're going to be looking at the criteria of team effectiveness. So these are the 6 conditions that help set up a great team to emerge. But then how are we actually measuring team effectiveness in the first place? And maybe we'll start to look at the end and the beginning. If the end goal is effectiveness, how do we measure that? Because there are different ways to measure it. And that leads to an interesting part of this puzzle to unpack as well.
That's great. Krister. So thanks again for the great conversation. Just to tee up our next episode 6, focused on the criteria of team effectiveness, and to invite you listeners to join in this conversation and reflect on this question. How would you know a great team if you saw one? What would you be paying attention to decide whether a team is a really great team? And we'll pick up with that conversation next time on episode 6. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. For show notes, links to great resources mentioned in the podcast, and for more information, go to 6teamconditions.com. See you next time on the 6 Conditions Podcast.